Alright, so a lot of people have asked why I lease my cars over buy my cars. And this may not, my logic at least, may not work for every car, but it works for Honda and it's worked for me. I've leased 4 Hondas and I'm doing okay. I know people are like, oh, well, you buy a car and then you don't have the monthly payment once it's paid off. Well, you can still buy out a leased car if you want. And I find that negotiating for a lease, at least with Honda, because the residual value is so high on the car, they will work with you more on price. Now, I have my 2023 Type R, and when I went to get the car, when I was going to buy the car, they wanted a $15,000 markup. And that was absolutely ridiculous. So, getting it on a lease, I didn't pay anywhere near a $15,000 markup. And for the sake of kind of what people are paying for the car becoming so crazy these days, I'm not even going to say how much I pay for this car. I will give numbers from other cars that I've had, and that's kind of where this starts. My first car that I leased was a 2013 Civic EX, and absolutely loved that car, but 140 miles were driven on that car with no oil in the engine, and it was a bad sensor. The dealership forgot to put oil in it. I was driving the car, it started to overheat. I pulled over, and I was also young. I was still in college. I really didn't know it didn't have oil in it until I drove it. At the time, I was a pizza delivery driver, so I put quite a few miles on that car with no oil in it until it finally just gave out. And when I realized it didn't have oil in it, I called the dealership, and they said, oh, can you drive it up here? The car had no oil in it. Why did they want me to drive it to the dealership? So they eventually got it towed to the dealership, and at the end of the lease, I had what my buyout number was, and I don't really remember what the buyout number was. I think it was like in the realm of like 13 or 14,000. And they were like, oh, we'll give you the car for 7,000, because of the fact that they could no longer sell that car to someone else because it drove that many miles without oil in it. So I wasn't going to be dumb enough to take that car off their hands, even if it was a great deal, because at the end of the day, that engine drove without oil in it, and it wasn't a great deal. So that was my first Civic. My second one, and these ones are when I start remembering the numbers, I had a 2018 Civic Si, and I got that car for $0 down, completely nothing to it signing, and then $280 a month, and that included the tire protection package that I was paying monthly for since I didn't put anything down. So that's a pretty good deal. $280 for a 2018 brand new, 10 miles on it Civic Si, $280 a month, $0 down. And I absolutely loved that car. And then 2 years later, the dealership called and said, hey, we have a 2020 Si. Do you want to move up to the 2020 from the 2018? And I said, absolutely I do. So I went into the dealership, and they terminated my lease early, and I ended up paying for the 2020 Si $290 a month with $0 down and the tire protection package. So $290 a month for the lease of the car and the tire protection package with $0 down. That was a really good deal to me. And I know people who were paying $400+ a month for the Si, and I was nowhere near that. So I find that Honda dealerships are really willing to negotiate the price of a lease over just selling the car outright. Now, the next argument people say is, that if you don't buy the car, you can't modify the car. And that's true to an extent. Now, I have modified my car slightly. And keep in mind, I would never go out and like paint the car or do something that's permanent to the car, weld something onto it or something like that. But you can do bolt-ons as long as you take them off. And every time I've had bolt-ons on the car, when I go into the dealership at the end of my lease, if I'm not going to buy it out or if I'm going to trade it in, and I say, do you want me to take all the performance parts off? Most of the time they say no. And I do anyway. Like, I had a K&N intake on my 2020 SI. I had the K tuner. So of course I took everything off, reverted it back to stock, ended up selling all those parts and making some money, and then just handing in the car normally. So just because you lease a car doesn't mean you can't do anything to it. Now, what you do have to keep in mind is that if you do something to the car and it voids the warranty, it's still your responsibility. If you blow up the engine in the car because you did a tune on it that shouldn't have been on the car, or someone wasn't familiar with it, then that's your own fault and you are held accountable. You can't just hand the car back in and say, it's not my problem, I don't own the car. You have to fix it and hand it in the same condition that it was given to you in. So there is kind of some caveats to that, where you can have some minor tears and wear and tear on the car, and Honda is kind of lenient with that. But I know in my 2013 Civic, I had to replace the carpet because they wanted to charge me for excessive wear and tear. Now I had the car for 4 years. I had 80,000 miles on the car, just about 80,000 miles on the car. And I had worn a hole through the carpet where my heel sat on the ground. So in order to not pay a fee, I ended up just replacing the carpet. I worked for Honda at the time. I got the carpet pretty cheap and replaced it, and it saved me a bunch of money. Another thing was my miles were over. So I had almost 80,000 miles on the car. I was allowed 60,000, but I ended up leasing another car, and it wasn't for me, it was for someone else. And because of that, they waived the overage miles. So it worked out really well that I leased the car. It had an issue. I didn't want to own that car 5 years down the road. And I was able to just hand the car back in and call it a day. Now, my lease on my 2020 SI was almost up. And so I was at the point where I had extended it. I could either buy the car out, or I could just trade it in and say, not my problem. Well, with that trade-in, it was worth $7,500 more than my buyout. My buyout was $14,000, and dealerships were giving me $21,000 to $23,000 for that car. So I could take that money, hand in the car to another Honda dealership, get a Type R, and there's money off my lease. So I always try to get cars that are going to go up in value. And it's kind of hard, but Honda makes it easier with the residual value. If you get an SI, if you get a Type R, those are cars that are going to hold their value because there's a limited number of them. So that's how I got a Type R. I traded in my 2020 SI, and I was not in the market for a Type R. I really had dreamed of a Type R, but it just didn't make sense financially. And then when all these dealerships were like, oh, your car, my 2020 SI, is worth so much more than my buyout, it kind of put this car into a price range where I could afford it. Now, I'm not paying under $300 a month for the Type R like I was with my other cars, but it put it into an area where I think I got a pretty good deal on the car, and I'm going to lease it. And I'm hoping that this car is worth more than my buyout. Now, I think this is going to be the last of the gas-powered Type Rs, so I'm hoping that helps it keep some residual value. If anyone in the future hates the whatever, if they come out with a hybrid or an electric, if people don't like that, they're going to want the gas-powered one. And the easiest ones to get are the FK8 and the FL5. And the FL5, I think, is a much better platform. I absolutely love this car. I have it tuned right now, so it's a pretty fun car. It's a really fun car. And this is a leased car too. So right now I have a PRL intake on order. I'm waiting to get it. I have the car tuned with Hondata, and I have an aftermarket subwoofer in the trunk, and it's all things that at the end of the lease, if I do go to trade it in or go to just hand it back in, I can take them off the car and be okay. If I painted the car, they'd probably have an issue with it. I'm not doing anything that's permanent. So let me know what you guys think. Do you lease your Hondas? Do you finance your Hondas? Do you pay cash for it? Now keep in mind, I wish I could pay cash for it, but I'm not in the point of my life where I have enough money to buy a car cash. So I lease, I keep it for however long the lease is for. I can always extend it. I can see what I want to do and what makes the most sense at the end of the lease. But in the sense of my first car, I didn't want to be stuck with that engine. If I had bought it, I'd be stuck with an engine that didn't have oil for 140 miles. And that's going to be my responsibility. But because I leased it and it was a screw up from Honda, I handed the car back in and said, not my problem. So it worked out really well.